Adolf Hitler spent almost a quarter of his time in office at his alpine retreat. From the mid-1930s, the Obersalzberg had become a restricted area, reserved for Nazi notables and guarded by the Reich Security Service and the Waffen-SS. This is where Hitler, the private man, stage-managed himself as the leader of the national community. This footage shows a visit by a group of Austrian girls in the summer of 1938. Day after day, people flocked to the Bearhof in droves.
He mesmerized them all. Everyone wanted to see Hitler. Chartered trains would arrive with hundreds of people, and they would all troop up to the Obersalzberg to meet Hitler. And he would come out, shake people's hands and kiss the children. Afterwards, they would collect pebbles on which Hitler had stood. And if he shook their hand, they wouldn't wash it. Or they would chop off little pieces of wood from the fence and frame them in gold, because Hitler had touched it.
Hitler frequently received state guests on the Obersalzberg. Newsreel cameras captured the same scenes over and over again, symbolic of his unlimited power. The stairs leading up to the Berghof, the enormous window, the Führer during briefings. Up here in this idyllic setting, the dictator mapped out many of his aggressive plans of war and destruction. Today, most of the buildings from that era no longer exist. They were destroyed by the Allied bombs, and the ruins were later blasted and cleared away. Deep inside the mountain, however, the subterranean bunker system has remained untouched. Recently, efforts have been made to ascertain the function of these miles of tunnels. They wanted to construct huge subterranean ammunition depots and build an access road into the mountain, so that Hitler, when he came from the valley, could drive into his mountain underground. He would have got out of the car there and gone up 100 meters in an elevator into his Berghof bunker, which had already been built. People on the Obersalzberg actually expected Hitler to come back right until the end. Work to expand and line this deep underground tunnel carried on intensely almost until the end of the war. They wanted to be prepared just in case Hitler returned to hole up here with his last devotees. Though Hitler decided to await the downfall in Berlin, his mountain never shed the shadows of the past. The dictator has shaped the history of the Obersalzberg too deeply. For over 100 years, Berchtesgaden and the surrounding mountains have been a popular holiday resort for summer and winter guests from all over Europe. The massifs of Watzmann, Hochkalter, Untersberg and Hoher Gerl form an imposing backdrop. Surrounded by all the summits that characterize the Berchtesgaden district, the Obersalzberg at the beginning of the 20th century was a thriving resort with many businesses and country houses of wealthy townspeople. One of the popular guest houses of the time was the Oberwürflehen, belonging to the Hülshoff family.
It used to be a perfect little world up here. The old Obersalzbergers were there for each other. They all stuck together. Then they heard that someone called Hitler was coming, the leader of a new nationalistic party. And my father said, "That can't be good. This is bound to mess things up."
Adolf Hitler first came to the Obersalzberg in 1923 to visit Dietrich Eckart, a nationalistic and anti-Semitic writer who was one of Hitler's major promoters. Using the alias Herr Wolf, he rented a room at the Pension Moritz, whose owner was one of Hitler's early supporters. Later on, he was given the use of a log cabin, where he dictated parts of the second volume of Mein Kampf. Hitler often retreated to the alpine isolation of Obersalzberg for weeks to indulge in his delusions and fantasize about the purity of the German race and the creation of Lebensraum in the East. Eventually, in 1928, he rented Haus Wachenfeld for 100 Reichsmarks a month, a cottage belonging to the widow of a businessman from Buxtehude. At first, Hitler had kept a low profile on the Obersalzberg. Now he had his personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, take pictures of him on his magic mountain that depicted him as a peaceful citizen and good-natured dog lover on holiday, seeking peace and quiet in the seclusion of the mountains. Nazi demonstrations and speeches were banned following Hitler's failed bearhof putsch, but this could not be sustained in the long term. From his base in Berchtesgaden, Hitler travelled across the country, giving rabble-rousing speeches. The restrictions of the peace treaty of Versailles, the world economic crisis, and mass unemployment drove flocks of voters to the Nazi Party. Haus Wachenfeld was extended and became Hitler's alpine base near the Austrian border, where he and his closest confidants conspired to take over power. Many Obersalzberg citizens regarded their new neighbors with suspicion.
He was always afraid that someone might harm him and was heavily guarded. Everything that went on in there was kept secret. No one else knew about it. They kept themselves to themselves. They were cut off from the local community, and they didn't want anything to do with them.
Hitler's half-sister, Angela Raubel, kept house for him on the Obersalzberg. Rare photographs show her daughter Geli with her uncle. Geli's suicide in 1931 gave rise to speculations about an intimate relationship between her and Hitler, but even their neighbors in the village were unable to find out any details.
We were children, and all we knew was that this oddball of a man was now living up there with his dogs. My father had brought back a military telescope after the First World War, which was set up on our terrace, and so we were able to watch everything that went on around Hitler's house and on his terrace. We had a lot of fun with it as children, but we must have been noticed because his sister, who was the housekeeper up there, told my father that we were to stop it at once.
After coming to power in Berlin, Hitler returned to Bavaria as the Chancellor of the Reich on the 12th of March 1933. The transformation of Germany into a dictatorial, despotic state had begun. Hitler's takeover of power brought about changes not only for the German Reich, but also for the Obersalzberg. The Führer's private hideaway increasingly became a popular destination for Hitler tourists, high-ranking functionaries, and party officials. In June 1933, Hitler bought Haus Wachenfeld for 40,000 gold marks. Supporters and curious visitors wishing to be close to the new Chancellor of the Reich now trooped to the Obersalzberg in crowds. Spontaneous homage was tolerated at first, but later only organized cheering was permitted. Nazi propaganda disseminated hundreds of thousands of photographs depicting pilgrimages to the Führer in order to create an image of Hitler as the Chancellor of the people.
Thousands of people would gather outside on the road, yelling Heil and singing. My mother once joined the crowd. She said, "I want to know what kind of people they are." And when she came back, she said, "I don't understand what's going on anymore."
After the Nazis' accession to power, the Obersalzberg saw some brisk construction activity. Using taxpayers' money, Hitler's private house was converted into a functioning seat of government. The former Haus Wachenfeld was remodeled into the Bearhof, with an enormous reception area in the center, featuring the famous grand picture window. The flashy construction was ready for occupation by mid-1936. Nazi leaders wanted to remain undisturbed on the Obersalzberg in the Führer's restricted area, which became the new second center of power. All other neighbors had to go. Martin Bormann was in charge of the conversion of the Obersalzberg. Being Rudolf Hess's chief of staff and manager of the Führer's assets, he began acquiring plots in the area surrounding the Berghof. The Obersalzberg Administration Department has meticulously recorded their acquisitions of property. This is an original list of all the buyouts. Marked in color here are all the dispossessions. Everything is recorded in detail. One can see how the buildings and properties were bought one by one, how people were forced to leave Obersalzberg. At first, Hitler insisted that Bormann buy the properties at the current market prices. As the Führer would not allow me to force the owners to sell, I had to pay extortionate prices, the party secretary complained in a letter. Many long-time Obersalzberg residents decided to sell. Their houses were immediately knocked down. The demolition work was carried out as fast as possible in order to spare the Führer the ugly sight of demolished buildings, is how Bormann justified the haste. However, some owners remained reluctant despite the fat rewards offered, so Bormann began to put pressure on them. One of the most stubborn neighbors was lung specialist Richard Seitz, who ran a children's sanatorium on the Obersalzberg.
You don't have to leave, they said. Of course you can stay. It's just that life might not be as easy for you as it was before. You see, we already knew what was going on. Word had got around that 2 people had wound up in the concentration camp in Dachau. I knew that we would get the eviction order on the 1st of January, and we'd have to leave the sanatorium with the children by the 1st of March.
The sanatorium was knocked down. Martin Bormann moved into the house of the Seitz family, which overlooked the Bearhof and most of the Obersalzberg complex. Martin Bormann was evidently the figure of power on the Obersalzberg. On this list, the Obersalzberg administration has recorded a total of 71 property transactions. One can see exactly how many square meters each property was. The summary at the end shows just 3 owners, Martin Bormann, Adolf Hitler and Hermann Goering. It's interesting that Martin Bormann acquired over 1,000 hectares in the name of the Obersalzberg administration. Adolf Hitler, in comparison, owned only 8 hectares, and Hermann Goering 1. The Oberwürfleyen house, too, lay in the vicinity of the Berghof. Josef Herzl, whose family had lived on the Obersalzberg for centuries, was one of those who refused to sell their property. He even remained obstinate after he lost his job. In the end, Bormann took on the case personally.
I remember that Bormann came to the house to see my father and told him, "Herr Herzl, if you don't go to the notary tomorrow, your whole family will end up in Dachau." So my father went to the notary straight away. After the sale, we had 3 days to vacate the house. And as soon as we'd moved the last load and drove away, they set the house on fire. They'd already pulled out some windows and laid detonation cables. What didn't burn in the fire was then blown up. And 3 days later, there was nothing left of the house.
The Oberwürfleyen was one of the last pre-Hitler Obersalzberg properties to be leveled.
The village community that had existed there for generations was gone, scattered all over the place. Everyone had to see where they could find accommodation. There were no neighbors, no houses left. Everything had been burnt down. It had become Hitler's empire. But I don't care anymore. I only need to close my eyes and I'm at home again. And I'll not let this memory be taken away from me.
The transformation of the Obersalzberg into Hitler's alpine center of power was now complete. This is where the dictator played to the gallery of his foreign guests, a demonstration of Germany's reclaimed international standing. The Berghof provided the perfect setting for Hitler, the statesman. Though he often bored his guests with long monologues, Hitler managed to arouse people's curiosity and win their sympathy. Even critical visitors were dazzled. After his visit to the Berghof, the liberal British politician David Lloyd George professed that the leader of the Germans was a really great man. Bormann had a tea house built for Hitler on the Moos-Lahner-Kopf. People with access into the Obersalzberg complex could follow the Führer's daily walk ritual.
There were 3 restricted zones, the first directly surrounding the Berghof, the next on the periphery, and the last with an even larger perimeter. No one was allowed in without showing their ID. The security service always went ahead and checked everything, even though it wasn't necessary. And if Hitler walked out of the house a quarter of an hour earlier than expected, there was always a commotion if the guards weren't at their posts. From the Berghof, he would walk to the tea house most of the time, either with guests or alone with his entourage. He went there quite frequently.
Sitting at the coffee table, Albert Speer wrote in his memoirs, Hitler liked to lose himself in endless soliloquies. As the topics were usually known to his company, they followed them inattentively while pretending to listen. Occasionally, Hitler fell asleep during one of his monologues. There's hardly a trace of the tea house today. It was demolished after the war, and the remains are now overgrown by the forest. The thoughts that were maturing in Hitler's mind in the seclusion of Obersalzberg became apparent in early 1938. On the 12th of February, Hitler received Austrian Chancellor Schuschnigg at the Berghof for talks on the future of Austria. After a cordial welcome, the host led Schuschnigg into his study, where he told his guest bluntly, "You don't seriously believe that you can delay me for even half an hour?" Hitler threatened him openly, "Who knows? Maybe I will come to Vienna overnight, like a spring storm." The Berghof perfectly fulfilled its function as Hitler's awe-inspiring center of power. 4 weeks after his visit, Schuschnigg's government was ousted by the National Socialists. The Austrians welcomed the Führer enthusiastically. On the Obersalzberg, an army of up to 8,000 workers labored on further developing the 100-hectare area. They built a farm to ensure a supply of quality food for Hitler. The Platterhof, which lay outside of the inner restricted zone, was converted into a hotel for party functionaries. A large barracks compound housed the SS Guard units. Along with Martin Bormann, Albert Speer and Hermann Goering also took possession of houses near the Berghof. Despite the outdoor pool, the country house of the second-in-command in the Nazi hierarchy appears almost modest by comparison. Here, Goering poses for the newsreel camera with his pet lion.
Ja, mein Cäsar, kommst du mich besuchen?
One of the few buildings to survive the remodeling of the Obersalzberg and the war unscathed is the country house acquired by Albert Speer. Hitler's architect even had his own studio within the restricted area, where he drew up increasingly outrageous plans for his Führer. Amateur footage discovered with a member of the SS in Austria in 1946 conveys the illusion of a harmless idyll on the Berghof terrace. A small circle of Hitler's acquaintances and associates frequented the Berghof. Nazi dignitaries, including Propaganda Minister Josef Goebbels and Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, were happy to be filmed alongside the Führer. Chief of SS Heinrich Himmler visited the Berghof in 1944 to consult with Hitler on the partisan problem and the annihilation of the Jews. These banal amateur films were shot by Hitler's lover Eva Braun. She had lived at the Berghof hidden from the public eye since 1936. Only few had an insight into Hitler's strictly shielded private life. A flock of servants, cooks and housemaids looked after the dictator and his guests. In May 1941, a 20-year-old girl from Lustdorf in Lower Austria started work as a chambermaid on the Obersalzberg.
The supervisors told me right from the start, anything you see or hear and anything that happens here doesn't leave the house. You are not to mention anything in your letters home. You must understand that this is not possible.
Officially, Eva Braun's function at the Berghof was that of the Führer's private secretary. Only the inner circle knew her to be the lady of the house, who accepted the staff's best wishes by Hitler's side on New Year's Day. Newcomers were instructed by the head housekeeper.
Frau Mittelstrasse explained to me how things were at the Berghof. When she showed me the layout of the rooms, she said, "You know, this room is Hitler's, this one is Frau Braun's, and there's a private passage between them. I'm sure you can imagine the rest."
After the war began, the Berghof set got to see less and less of the dictator. The days were spent organizing uninspired parties or watching films. The daily routine of the service staff was a lot stricter whenever Hitler was on the Obersalzberg. When the Führer found out about his deputy party leader Rudolf Hess's flight to Great Britain, the atmosphere in the Berghof grew extremely tense.
It was awful at the beginning, because we had to keep completely quiet. There was a notice in front of Hitler's study that read, "Absolute quiet." In fact, I wrote home that Hitler was always working and that he needed complete peace and quiet. It was the time when he was preparing for the war against Russia.
Hitler used his retreat in the Alps to plan the war of aggression against the Soviet Union. He would often return to the Berghof from his headquarters to confer with his allies and representatives of friendly countries. As the Berghof was too small for grand state receptions, Hitler had Klesheim Castle near Salzburg converted for this purpose after the annexation of Austria. This Baroque gem had formerly been a hunting lodge for Salzburg's archbishops.
Zusammenkunft des Führers mit dem Duce in Salzburg.
Many key decisions concerning the war plans of the Axis powers were made during the regular consultations in Klesheim Castle. Hitler demanded allegiance from his partners not only in military matters, but also regarding his annihilation plans. On the 18th of March 1944, he accused Hungary's head of state, Miklos Horthy, during his visit to Klesheim of having secret negotiations with the Allies and of permitting nearly 1 million Jews to live freely in his country. Horthy was to invite the Wehrmacht into Hungary immediately, a country that had not yet been occupied. In the end, Horthy yielded to the pressure and returned to Budapest in the company of senior SS officials. 1 month later, the deportations of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz began. Over 400,000 were murdered there in the space of just 2 months. A new railway track was built especially for this purpose in Auschwitz. This image shows Jews from the Carpathians at the ramp during the selection process. The idyllic world of the Obersalzberg and the seeming tranquility of the Bearhof and its inhabitants were maintained even during the war. Up here, the dictator seemed inviolable. Hitler's security was provided by his personal bodyguard, members of the SS Leibstandarte, who had their own shooting range on the complex. As of 1943, the SS security forces were mainly worried about potential Allied parachute operations aiming to assassinate the dictator. In his Hollywood-produced spy thriller, Manhunt from 1941, German expatriate director Fritz Lang demonstrated how such an assassination attempt could be accomplished. The film was set in pre-war Germany. A British secret agent who has made his way to the Obersalzberg unnoticed has Hitler in his sights, takes aim with his hunting rifle, only to falter in the end. The film's scenario became a serious consideration when the British government commissioned plans to assassinate Hitler on the Obersalzberg. Under the codename Operation Foxley, the British Secret Service compiled a 120-page dossier with all available information on the target's daily routine and walk routes on the Obersalzberg, and drew up detailed maps. A member of Hitler's SS Guard detail, possessing extensive and classified knowledge of the inner restricted area, had been arrested during the battle in Normandy. The configuration of Operation Foxley was completed by the summer of 1944. Churchill, however, wanted the Germans to be defeated on the battlefield. At the beginning of 1945, when victory over Nazi Germany had become a matter of weeks, Operation Foxley was suspended. The plans of the British Secret Service had made provisions not only for the SS Guards and ammunition depots, but also for the existence of secret bunker systems. We're entering the netherworld beneath the Obersalzberg. For years, a specialist team has been exploring and surveying the underground shelters. A shaft underneath the former SS barracks leads 30 meters into the earth. No one knew what they would find there, as the wooden staircase had collapsed decades ago. The researchers discovered 350 meters of unfinished tunnels. The first caverns had been lined with bricks, and the cable ducts had been partly concreted. There had already been almost 6 kilometers of tunnels and bunkers when Martin Bormann evidently decided to extend the system. Construction crews worked feverishly, doing 3 shifts a day, until the Allied air raid on the 25th of April, 1945. This is a bunker for the SS, which was dug at an enormous depth and was therefore not easily accessible due to this long shaft that was built under here. Digital surveying now enables us for the first time to form a complete and accurate picture of the entire Obersalzberg underground constructions. If we combine the information from the records of the Obersalzberg administration regarding the tunnel constructions and the testimonies of witnesses, we come to the conclusion that this whole shelter area was laid out for the protection of approximately 400 SS men, as well as storage for large ammunition depots that would be used to defend this alleged alpine fortress.
Zur Verteidigung dieser vermeintlichen Alpenfestung angelegt worden.
Calculations show that the end of the Bearhof bunker is just 10 meters away. The plan was probably to connect the two bunkers for quick access from the SS barracks to Hitler. Construction work on the underground tunnels had begun in the summer of 1943. After the liberation of North Africa by the Allied forces, Hitler's alpine residence was now within range of their bomber squadrons. The frenzied activity did not go unnoticed by the other Obersalzberg inhabitants.
Everyone knew they were building bunkers. They couldn't possibly have kept it secret. There were so many workers. There were Italian and Czech labourers. There was the Army Tunnel Construction Company. There was the Reich Labour Service. Bormann was omnipresent. You could count on him turning up all over the place. He supervised the whole project and put the pressure on. They used to call him the Lord of the Obersalzberg.
Martin Bormann, Hitler's governor of the Obersalzberg, had a bunker constructed for the dictator and his household directly under the Berghof. The first section was completed by Christmas 1943. Of course, Bormann also provided for his sizable family. An underground tunnel system branching out in all directions was opened up under his villa. Today, it can only be entered with special authorization. 77 stairs led directly from Bormann's house into the underworld. The private rooms were accessible through a 60-meter-long passage. For their defense, protected machine gun positions have been installed along the corridor. The entire Obersalzberg bunker complex was absolutely self-sufficient as regards supplies. There was enough fresh water, an anti-gas ventilating system, there were ample stocks of food supplies, so it would have been possible to hold out for a long time. The problem was that one could not have protected the entrances from the outside, but only from the inside. There were no fortifications outside the tunnels, which means that the enemy could besiege the area and penetrate into the shelters up to the machine gun positions without resistance. This is the area the Bormanns used. 3 ventilated rooms with bunk beds for the children. It's interesting that one deliberately chose a relatively warm color to paint the walls so that the surroundings will not appear quite so bleak.
Hier bewusst eine relativ warme Farbe verwendet worden ist, dieses Dasein unter Tage nicht ganz so öde zu gestalten.
The light switches in the children's rooms were also lower than usual. They were installed about 50 centimeters lower than elsewhere in the bunker. The floors were made of wood. You can imagine the bunk bed standing here. The Bormanns spent weeks at a time down here. Of course, they didn't live exclusively in the bunker. They were up in the house too. But the danger of an Allied air raid onto the Obersalzberg was imminent by the end of 1943, so the Bormanns had made themselves comfortable down here. Bormann's safe was removed by the Americans after the end of the war. Its outlines are still evident. A communications center outfitted with the most up-to-date equipment of the time received the latest radio messages and news from the fronts. When danger from the air was imminent, smoke cannons would enshroud the Obersalzberg in fog. In early 1944, Hitler watched a demonstration of this defensive measure. He had transferred his headquarters to Berchtesgaden and was planning to spend the next few months at the Berghof, where he felt safe from Allied bombing raids. The strategic unsuitability of the area was quickly apparent to the new SS commander on the Obersalzberg.
Es ist ein ganz großer Irrtum,
To think of Obersalzberg as a military object in any way would be a total misconception. In fact, from a military point of view, the Obersalzberg was quite simply a mousetrap. The troops that I found here at that time were all sent to the front during the following weeks and months. From the over 2,000 men stationed here initially, only a few were left behind at the end. All the others were sent to the front and were replaced by female SS troops, who worked the smoke guns, and by 16 to 18-year-old Reich Labour Service youngsters who manned the flak. Anti-aircraft guns were installed around the so-called Eagle's Nest on Kehlstein Mountain. This second tea house was commissioned by Bormann in 1939 as a present for Hitler's 50th birthday. But it seemed the dictator was afraid of heights, so he only rarely visited the Kehlstein house. On the 3rd of June 1944, the Bearhof set celebrated its last party up there. It was the day Eva Braun's sister, Gretel, married SS squadron leader Hermann Fegelein, a man whose SS cavalry division was responsible for the death of tens of thousands of civilians at the Eastern Front. During the final days of the war, Fegelein was arrested for desertion and executed on Hitler's orders in the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. The last known footage of Hitler on the Obersalzberg shows him with the bride and groom. He left the Berghof in mid-July. Hermann Goering, Hitler's designated successor and head of the Luftwaffe, spent a lot of time on the Obersalzberg with his family. Since British and American bombers were now destroying more and more German cities without much resistance, his prestige among the population had suffered greatly. The tranquil alpine setting helped him to forget his defeats. Goering too had a tunnel system running underneath his country house, but his was not connected with the other Obersalzberg bunkers. All air raid shelters were stocked with food at the beginning of April 1945, and items of value and furniture were also moved underground. The Nazi leaders could have held out for weeks in their subterranean hideouts, yet the commander at Obersalzberg did not think that Hitler would come back here.
Es gab unglaublich ausgebaute Bunker und
the bunkers and underground facilities were really phenomenal. However, should an enemy unit manage to advance to the Obersalzberg, all they needed to do was to block the entrances to the bunkers, and whoever was in them would be trapped. The question of whether Hitler should have come to the Obersalzberg was idiotic and didn't even arise. This is probably why Hitler rejected Bormann's urgent requests that he retreat to Obersalzberg.
Abgelehnt, dass zum Obersalzberg ausweicht.
Goering finally decided to leave Berlin with his underlings and flee to the Obersalzberg. Evidently, the Reichsmarschall was still hoping he could negotiate a separate peace deal with the Western Allies. On the 23rd of April 1945, he sent Hitler a wire from Obersalzberg setting him an ultimatum. Bormann succeeded in convincing Hitler that Goering, the Führer's old companion, had betrayed him. On the same night, Goering was stripped of all his offices. He was sitting at a desk. I announced myself and said, "Herr Reichsmarschall, I received a telegram from the Führer." "Yes, let me see," he said. I handed it to him, and after a rather long pause, he told me, "I suppose you have to arrest me now."
Und dann hat gesagt, dann müssen Sie mich ja wohl verhaften.
On the following day, Allied aircraft in England were loaded with bunker buster bombs. The British Secret Service had apparently intercepted information that the dictator would be on the Obersalzberg the day after. RAF bombers flew for 4.5 hours. Just before 9 a.m., the first of nearly 400 aircraft reached their target without encountering any resistance.
We were going up the slope when the anti-aircraft guns started firing. We could hear the airplanes. The noise was terrible. Then we knew that this was serious. We ran back in through the kitchen, and bombs exploded all around us. Or maybe it was the flak guns. We saw the window panes shake and then shatter. We quickly ran straight to the tunnel entrance, leaving everything behind. And there were the men from the air raid rescue team. We waited for a while and then the first wave came. The power went out with the first bombs and we sat in the dark.
In panic, people fled to the air raid shelters. Hermann Goering, who was under arrest, was escorted to his bunker by SS men down the narrow stairs with his wife and daughter at the last moment. From a height of 6 kilometers, an automatic camera filmed the air raid on the Obersalzberg on the 25th of April 1945. The last bombs were dropped at 2 minutes to 11.
It took quite some time before we could get out. Then we saw the inferno. Bomb crater after bomb crater. Not one blade of grass, no bushes left. The buildings were destroyed. Bormann's house was severely damaged. Goering's house was damaged. The Bearhof was damaged. The barracks were ruined. It was a wasteland.
A few days later, Allied aerial footage documented the destruction. The ruins were a big attraction for the population, as the overflowing bunkers had remained intact.
We went back up, and there was no one there. The local authorities had permitted pillaging. So we went searching for provisions. There was enough food to last 1,000 years in the bunkers. Sugar, flour, rice. People were carrying away barrels of French cognac. There was everything you can imagine. Other people took crystal, silver cutlery, china, or Meissen porcelain, all sorts of porcelain, but we only took food.
Miraculously, Berchtesgaden was not damaged by the bombs. At the beginning of May 1945, the population awaited the arrival of the victors. On the 4th of May, US and French troops entered the town almost simultaneously. Up until the very end, US Commander-in-Chief Eisenhower was concerned about rumors that Nazi leaders and fanatic SS units had barricaded themselves in a so-called alpine fortress and would offer fierce resistance. However, these rumors proved to be false. As a final signal of their reign of terror, departing SS troops set fire to the ruin of the Bearhof. American war correspondent Lee Miller witnessed the bizarre scene. It was like a funeral pyre of the Third Reich, she wrote in her report.
We were standing outside in the garden, watching the Berghof burn. And my father said to my mother, "You see, now they're getting exactly what they did to us. Now their property is being burnt down too."
A few days later, US Commander Omar Bradley inspected the last prize of the war. Followed by the camera, Bradley walked up the stairs to Hitler's Berghof and took possession of the dead dictator's center of power in the name of the USA. Curious Berchtesgaden citizens also ventured into the ruins. Considering that this was once the Führer's residence, with lots of fine furniture and valuable carpets and so on, the picture was devastating. The carpets had disappeared, a lot of the wood was battered and splintered, the tableware shattered, the cutlery bent and soiled and useless. It actually looked as if the place had been vandalized.
Also vandalisch eigentlich.
The victors also inspected the underground bunkers. An area of 1,800 square meters had been prepared to house Hitler and his entourage. The Americans confiscated the dictator's collection of paintings and library, which were stored in the shelter. Hitler's private archives had been burned by his aide Julius Schaub before capitulation. Eva Braun's bedroom had evidently been the site of riotous parties celebrated by people who had gained unauthorized access after the end of the war. The shelter had been ready for occupancy by April 1945 and was filled with a substantial collection of clothes and porcelain. Acting on Hitler's orders, police detectives had later tried, unsuccessfully, to destroy everything that pointed to Eva Braun's existence. On Braun's special request, a bathroom with a tub had been fitted into the air protection shelter. Little of this remains today. The rooms are deserted. Still, illicit treasure hunters on the search for valuables often break into the bunker system. Hitler's room was right next to Eva Braun's. It's said to have been rather austerely furnished. The Americans removed the fixtures, and the rest was taken by tourists. Even the tiles from the bathroom became dubious souvenirs. Interestingly, Hitler had only been down here once. The troops also discovered parts of Hermann Goering's art collection in the bunkers. The Reichsmarschall had been snatching treasures of immense value from Nazi-occupied territories. After the air raid, Goering was helped to escape to neighboring Austria, where he was arrested by US soldiers in early May 1945. After the end of the war, the ruin of the bearhof with the gigantic picture window became one of the most popular attractions for American GIs in Europe. The soldiers named the tea house on the Kehlstein Eagle's Nest. It was the only place left intact, where they could visualize how the dictator once lived. Further down on the Obersalzberg, Hitler's soldiers cleared the rubble, and German prisoners of war disposed of the remnants of the Führer's restricted zone. The ruins of the Berchtesgaden, however, were left untouched, and soon became a place of pilgrimage for diehards.
51 oder 52 war ich noch einmal.
I went up there again in 1951 or 52 and was able to enter the ruin without a problem. It looked tidier this time. The partly collapsed roof had been removed. What I found appalling was the graffiti on the inside of the walls. All the remaining walls were covered with Hitler slogans. Some were so high up, you'd need a ladder to reach them. The inside of the entire Berghof was full of fascist slogans like Heil Hitler and Heil to our Führer, or if only we had you back again, and so on and so forth. I assume that was actually the reason they blew up the ruins of the Berghof shortly after. In 1952, the American occupying power and the local government of Bavaria decided to dispose of the remains of the Berghof. On the 30th of April, exactly 7 years after Hitler's suicide, demolition charges blew up the ruins. The foundations of Hitler's second seat of government in the Alps were finally removed in 1995. Today, it's hard to imagine that Hitler's house once stood here. And yet, the Obersalzberg will probably never again revert to being just an ordinary health resort.